The wind had a bite to it that evening, a sharpness that told of winter pressing down from the mountains. The mesas stretched endless and empty, their edges smudged beneath ash-gray clouds. Elias Hart set his weight against a leaning fence post, boots sunk deep in the cold soil, hammer ringing against the nail. His shoulders ached, his hands raw, yet he moved with the same stubborn rhythm he had carried since grief hollowed him. The ranch was too big for one man, but he tended it anyway. The silence was his companion, the dust his company. When the last board settled into place, Elias straightened, stretching his back until the bones creaked. The air smelled of iron and frost. Cattle lowed faintly in the distance, unsettled by the coming storm. He wiped his brow, though the sweat had already chilled, and started for the cabin light flickering through the gloom. That was when he saw her. A figure moved along the fence line, no louder than the scrape of brush in the wind. At first he thought it a shadow, some trick of failing light, but then the figure came nearer, a young woman, shawl torn, braid loosened by the long miles. Her steps were slow, more dragged than placed, as though each one cost her dearly. She stopped when she saw him. No weapon in her hands, no plea on her lips. Only her eyes lifted, dark with fatigue, and she said quietly, "I need warmth." No more than that. Not water, not food. Only warmth. Elias's hand hovered near the hammer at his belt. His gut tensed with the old mistrust that came hard-earned on this land. She was Apache. The territory had long been a wound cut open by raids, reprisals, and blood along the arroyos. He had lost neighbors, cattle, and sleep to the uncertainty of that border life. But he looked closer and saw she carried no rifle, no knife, only the frayed shawl drawn tight against the cold. The words of his dead wife whispered against his heart, though he had not heard her voice in years. "Do not harden so fully that you forget you are human." "Come," Elias said at last, his voice rough as gravel. Not warm, but not closed. He gestured toward the cabin, and she followed at a careful distance, neither hurried nor hesitant, only steady, as if dignity was all she had left. Inside, the fire burned low. Elias set fresh wood upon it, the crackle filling the silence between them. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, leather, and the bitter remains of coffee left cooling in the pot. The rocking chair sat in its usual place by the hearth, though it had not moved in months. In the corner, covered with cloth, rested a chest that held what remained of another life, a wedding dress folded carefully away, untouched since the earth took its wearer. The woman, Nalin, though he did not yet know her name, stood by the door as if unsure whether to cross the threshold fully. Her shawl was torn, her braid half unraveled, strands of black hair catching the firelight like threads of ink. Her face bore the weariness of miles and of losses unspoken. "You can sit," Elias said. He nodded toward the chair opposite the fire. His own weight lowered onto the bench. She sat, silent still, arranging her shawl close around her shoulders. The flames lit her eyes, and for the first time Elias saw that they were not merely tired but watchful, measuring him as he measured her. He poured a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter, and set it on the table between them. She reached for it slowly, like a hand extended toward something fragile. She sipped, grimaced at the strength, but drank. No words followed. The wind outside pushed hard against the shutters, rattling them as though eager to come inside. The cattle lowed again. Elias's gaze fell to the fire, then back to her. She was no threat, not tonight. Still, his chest felt tight with something he could not name. He told himself she would leave by morning. That was safest for her, for him, for the memory of the woman he had buried beneath the cottonwood years ago. She told herself she would not beg. If warmth was all he offered, she would take no more. She had begged enough in her life to men who gave nothing back but scorn. The silence stretched. It was not empty silence, but weighted, carrying in it the things they did not yet dare to speak. His loneliness, her exile, his mistrust, her dignity. Both sat in the glow of the fire, two strangers bound for a single night by necessity and something deeper, unnamed. Elias leaned back, the bench creaking beneath him. He studied the scars across his hands, lines of old labor and harder days. She studied the fire, her braid slipping forward across her shoulder, frayed but still intact. The space between them remained colder than the wind outside, yet both knew they would not turn away from it. Not tonight. For survival on the frontier often began not with courage, nor with trust, but with a door left unlocked, and so As the wind keened over the mesas and snow threatened in the clouds, Elias Hart and the woman called Nalin sat in silence, firelight touching their faces, each pretending that morning would bring an ending. Deep down, though, something whispered otherwise. Beginnings do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they come with nothing more than a quiet knock at the heart, answered by reluctant hands and a single request: I need warmth. Morning came gray and slow, the kind of light that bled through cloud and frost without warming the earth. Elias stirred before dawn as always, though the night had been restless. The fire in the hearth had sunk to coals, leaving the cabin heavy with the scent of smoke and the faint hiss of dying embers. He rose, stiff in the joints, and fed the fire with pine until the flames licked high again. When he turned, he saw her still seated by the chair she had claimed, shawl wrapped tight, chin dipped to her chest. She had not dared lie down upon his bedroll, though he had left it spread by the wall. Pride kept her upright through the night. Yet the wear of travel pulled her head low. As the flames brightened, Elias saw more than the silhouette of exhaustion. Her hands lay folded on her lap, and the raw edges caught the light, rope burns scabbed and red, curling around her wrists like brands. His jaw clenched. That kind of mark told stories of capture, of bondage, of struggle against ties not meant to hold a free soul. He did not ask. Questions could wait if they had a place at all. He busied himself with the kettle, pouring water over grounds left coarse from his last grinding. The rich, bitter smell filled the cabin, mingling with smoke and the faint leather scent of saddles drying by the door. He set the pot near the fire and turned away, giving her space to rouse. Nalin lifted her head slowly, eyes adjusting to the cabin in daylight. The room revealed its secrets under the pale wash of morning. Walls of rough-hewn timber, shelves lined with tools mended more often than replaced, and in the far corner, a chest draped with a cloth that could not quite conceal its shape. She looked longer, and the corner of fabric slipped, enough to reveal white tucked within, aged linen folded with care. A dress, a woman's dress, the kind worn once in vows and never again. Her gaze lingered. She did not need to ask. She knew the way grief left objects untouched, how the dead remained through what they left behind. She had seen it in her own people, in shawls kept after mothers fell to fever, in necklaces clutched by men who had buried sisters or wives. That chest was not storage. It was shrine. Elias felt her noticing but did not acknowledge it. He set a tin cup of coffee on the table, his hand steady though his chest stirred with the unease of memory exposed. She accepted it without words. The silence between them was not empty. It pressed heavy, full of questions neither wished to open. Elias wondered if she carried danger in her shadow, if pursuers trailed her steps, if violence would someday cross his threshold because he had offered her warmth. Yet when he looked at her wrists, his mistrust faltered. Nalin, meanwhile, saw the weight that bent his shoulders, the lines etched deeper than weather alone could carve. She recognized the shadow of a man already half buried, tending land not because it lived but because he had promised a ghost he would keep it standing. They spoke little. When Elias asked, "Hungry?" she shook her head, though the hollowness in her cheeks betrayed her answer. He left a piece of cornbread on the table anyway, turning away so she might take it without the sting of charity. She ate it slowly, each bite measured. Hours passed in the rhythm of quiet labor. Elias saddled his horse and rode the fence line, returning by mid-morning with frost stiff on his hat brim. When he stepped inside, he paused. Nalin had found a torn shirt hung forgotten on a nail, its sleeve ripped where wire had caught it. She sat near the fire, mending it with careful stitches pulled from a length of thread she carried in a small pouch. The sight caught him unsteady. No one had taken up his shirt since his wife. No one had thought to. He said nothing, only hung his coat by the door. Yet when he set his rifle down, it did not rest across his lap as it had the night before. He left it propped by the door, close enough for reach but distant enough to signal something unspoken. She noticed. Her eyes flicked once to the rifle, then to him. She bent again to her stitching. The day wore on in such fragments. His steps heavy against the wooden floor, her needle whispering through cloth, the fire crackling, the kettle hissing. Words were scarce, but each silence carried more than speech might have. By evening, shadows stretched long across the cabin, and the light through the shutters turned the walls a dull copper. Elias sat by the table, hands wrapped around his coffee cup, though it had long gone cold. Nalin finished her mending, folded the shirt neatly, and laid it where he would find it. Their eyes met once, brief, then parted again. Ghosts crowded the room. His wife's absence, her people's loss, the wars and betrayals that hung between settler and native. Yet none of those ghosts spoke louder than the simple, unadorned truth. They both knew abandonment, though in different forms. He by death, she by exile. The fire hissed as sap cracked within the wood. Elias leaned back, the rocking chair creaking once as though waking from years of stillness. He did not rock, only sat, eyes on the flames. Nalin pulled her shawl close and lowered her head, the day's weight pressing down again. No words of gratitude left her lips, no plea for tomorrow's shelter. She would not beg. He would not offer more than was needed. And yet in the space where silence grew thick, something fragile began to take root. Trust, perhaps. Not spoken, not secure, but real enough that when night fell again, they shared the same fire without suspicion heavy between them. Pain was a language they both understood, and in that unspoken tongue something passed between them. Acknowledgement, recognition, the faint beginning of belonging. The storm came sudden, rolling down from the northern mountains like a wall of white. By afternoon, the air had grown sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the first flakes carried on a wind that clawed at skin and timber alike. Elias had just driven the cattle toward the lower pasture, their breath rising in ragged clouds, when the snow thickened to a curtain that swallowed distance and sound. By dusk, the land lay muffled beneath drifts, the mesas lost in a blur of white. The cabin shuddered under gusts, shutters rattling like bones in a tin box. Elias stabled the horse, pulled the last buckets of water, and barred the door against the night. The storm settled in with a howl, filling every crevice, shaking the world down to firelight and shadows. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and damp wool. Nalin sat close to the fire, shawl drawn around her shoulders, eyes on the flames. She did not complain, though the cold crept through the cracks no matter how tightly Elias set the wood. Her braid hung loose now, strands slipping free in the heat's glow, and she held her hands out to the blaze as though afraid the warmth might vanish if she looked away. Elias poured coffee, dark and bitter, and handed her a cup. She accepted with a nod, fingers brushing the tin. For a while only the storm spoke, hissing against the roof, moaning through the chimney. Then came the knock. It was not loud, 3 firm raps, almost swallowed by the gale. Elias froze, cup halfway to his lips. Visitors were rare in this country, rarer still on nights when the earth itself seemed to drive men indoors. The knock came again. He set the cup aside, rose, and reached for the rifle leaning by the door. "Stay back," he said quietly to Nalin. Her eyes sharpened, but she obeyed, stepping into the shadow of the hearth. When he drew the door open, the storm rushed in with a cry, and with it came a figure wrapped in a cavalry coat, hat dusted white. The man's cheeks were raw with wind, beard bristling with frost. "Evenin'," he said through chattering teeth. "Storm caught me out. I'll not last without shelter." Elias studied him, barrel lowered but steady. The man's stance bore no desperation, only the hard set of one who had long lived by his wits. Finally, Elias stepped aside. "Get in." The stranger entered, stamping snow from his boots, shaking the cold off like a wolf in a pen. He pulled off his gloves and flexed hands marked by old scars. His eyes swept the cabin once, taking measure of the place. They paused when they found Nalin. His smirk rose slow, as if he had uncovered some secret prize. "Didn't expect company." Nalin's shawl tightened around her shoulders. She turned slightly toward the fire, though not enough to break from his gaze. Elias caught the exchange, the way the man's eyes lingered too long, the way Nalin's stillness carried old fear. "Sit," Elias said. His tone carried no invitation, only command. He gestured toward the bench by the table. "Storm'll pass by morning. You'll ride on then." The man chuckled low. "Don't worry, rancher. I'll not trouble your guest." His glance toward Nalin made the word drip with implication. Elias set the rifle back against the wall, close enough for his hand. He poured another cup of coffee, slid it across the table. The stranger took it, sipping with a grimace. The hours stretched long. The storm battered the walls. Cattle lowed restlessly from the shed, and inside the cabin 3 figures held their silence. Elias sat near the hearth, watchful, eyes half on the fire, half on the stranger. Nalin sewed at a torn hem, each stitch deliberate, though her hand trembled when the wind struck the roof hard enough to rattle the beams. The stranger leaned back, stretching legs before the fire. "Name's Cole," he said at last. Rode with the cavalry once out of Fort Sumner. Done my share of scouting these lands. Elias nodded but offered no name in return. Cole's smile thinned. Silent type then, fine. Don't need words to see you're a man, keeps to yourself still. Strange times when an Apache girl finds herself at a white man's fire. Nalin's head lifted at that, eyes dark and sharp. But she said nothing. Her dignity was in her silence. Elias's jaw tightened. He did not rise to the bait, though his hand itched toward the rifle. Instead, he said, "Storm's thick. You'll want rest. Floor's yours." Cole chuckled again, but let the matter rest, sprawling against the wall, coat pulled around him. Soon his breathing slowed, though Elias knew sleep could be a mask as much as rest. The wind howled through the night, but Elias did not sleep. He sat by the fire, rifle propped within reach, eyes moving from the blaze to the shadowed shape of Cole, then to Nalin, who had curled near the hearth with her shawl close. She did not look at him, but the tilt of her head, the way her shoulders eased when she saw the rifle near his hand, spoke enough. He realized then that his vigilance was no longer for himself alone. Somewhere between mistrust and necessity, something had shifted. His silence had become shield, his presence a barrier against the dangers that still stalked the land. And Nalin, though she gave no word of thanks, knew it too. She remembered other men, soldiers who had looked at her with hunger or disdain. This one, scarred by grief and hardened by dust, did not look at her as spoil. In the white hush of the blizzard, warmth felt for the first time in years like something she might share rather than steal. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, 3 souls held vigil, but only 2 hearts found a fragile accord. The storm broke at last, but the world it left behind was brittle and sharp. Snow lay crusted over the land, gleaming in the pale sun. Yet the cold cut deeper than before, as though the storm had stripped the marrow from the air. The cattle stood stiff-legged in the drifts, steam curling from their muzzles, and the fences glistened with ice. Inside the cabin, warmth held, but the air was no easier. Cole had lingered past necessity, claiming the storm still blocked the trails, though Elias knew the sky had cleared enough for a man to ride. The scout settled himself as though the cabin were his by right. He sprawled on the bench, left his muddy boots near the hearth, and drank from Elias's coffee pot without asking. It was not his presence alone, but the way his eyes roamed. They fixed too often on Nalin, watching her when she bent to tend the fire, when she lifted her cup, when her braid slipped forward over her shoulder. She answered his stares with silence, but her shawl tightened around her frame each time. Once Cole's glance wandered toward the chest, draped with cloth in the corner. He rose, boots clomping, and pulled the cover back with a smirk. The wedding dress lay folded inside, yellowed with years, yet still holding its fragile grace. "Well now," he drawled, chuckling low. "Seems you keep more than cattle here, Hart. Ghosts dressed in white. No wonder you sit quiet as stone." Elias's hand twitched near his cup, but he did not move. His eyes locked on Cole, unblinking. The silence that followed was sharp as a knife's edge. At last Cole let the cloth fall back, laughing to himself as he returned to the bench. Nalin's gaze lingered on Elias then, just for a heartbeat. She had seen men answer insult with fists, with steel, with fury. This man did none of those things. Yet the tension in his stillness, the restraint that bordered on breaking, carried more weight than rage. For the first time she found herself leaning, however slightly, toward the steadiness he held. Days passed that way, each hour stretched taut. The storm outside had gone, but inside the cabin another storm brewed, quieter, more dangerous. At night, Nalin lay wrapped in her shawl near the fire, unable to sleep. She heard the creak of wood, the measured pace of footsteps. Cole prowled the small space, restless as a caged wolf. The sound of his boots on the floorboards kept her heart awake, her body tense. One night, the steps grew closer. She felt his shadow fall across her even through closed eyes. Before fear could turn to motion, another sound cut the dark. The slow scrape of a chair and the unmistakable click of a rifle being lifted. "Back to your place," Elias's voice said, calm but heavy. The silence that followed held more threat than any shout. Cole shifted, boots retreating across the floor, and the pacing stopped. Morning came pale and unforgiving. Elias stepped outside at first light, his breath clouding in the brittle air. He returned to find Cole pulling on his coat, a scowl twisting his mouth. "You've made it clear enough," Cole said. His voice carried bitterness, but not courage enough to test what lay behind Elias's steady gaze. "I'll ride on." He shoved his hat down, pulled the door open, and let the cold rush in. His boots crunched across the frozen yard, his figure swallowed soon by the white beyond the fence line. The cabin settled in his absence. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It no longer pressed down like a weight. Instead, it breathed. Elias leaned the rifle back in its corner, his hand lingering on the stock a moment longer before letting go. Nalin sat near the fire, her face turned away, but her shoulders eased for the first time in days. The cabin was both prison and sanctuary. Its walls had held them in, forced them close, forced them to see what each carried. For Elias, restraint had reached its edge. To keep his world unbroken, he had to step into conflict, if only with quiet words and the presence of steel nearby. For Nalin, survival had taken a different form. Strength found not in defiance, but in knowing she was not alone in the fight. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. The fire burned between them, steady, and for the first time its warmth seemed shared. When Cole's figure disappeared into the white horizon, silence reclaimed the land. The cabin, once heavy with his restless pacing and crude remarks, seemed to breathe again. Outside, the snow glared bright under the brittle sun, but inside the air softened as though the walls themselves had exhaled relief. That evening, Nalin tended the fire with unusual care. She knelt close, feeding the flames with slender logs, her movements slow and deliberate. It was not just wood she placed there, but something quieter, an offering perhaps, or a promise to keep what warmth they had alive. Elias watched her from the table, his hands busy with old tools. A whetstone rasped against a dull blade, the rhythm steady, grounding. In the flicker of lamplight, they occupied the same space with more ease than before. Words once scarce began to pass between them in fragments. She asked about the weather, and he answered with the measured wisdom of a rancher who read the skies like scripture. He spoke of cattle restless in storms, of fences needing repair before thaw. She listened, her eyes on the fire, as though such talk, small and practical, held the weight of scripture too. Later she told him of a valley where the snow melted first, where grasses greened before others. Her voice carried memory, not longing. He listened without interruption, though the image of her voice, gentle, low, woven with loss, stayed with him long after the words ended. Nights stretched into something softer. He sat in the rocking chair again, though he did not rock, only leaned back with the rifle propped nearby. She sewed by the fire or braided her hair anew, fingers working with a precision that stilled the room. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not, yet the silences no longer weighed heavy. They had become a kind of language themselves. It was one such evening, the fire burning steady and the lamp throwing shadows against the timber walls, when she spoke what had remained unspoken. "My people sent me away." Her eyes stayed on the flame, not on him. "They said I no longer belonged. I had lived too long among those who despised us. I was neither theirs nor yours. A ghost between." Elias's hand stilled on the whetstone. The quiet that followed was not the old silence, sharp with mistrust, but something gentler, space for truth to settle. Nalin drew her shawl tighter. "Exile is worse than death, for it leaves you wandering without a name. Without a fire." Her voice thinned, almost breaking, yet she steadied it. "So I walk." The fire popped, a log collapsing inward. Elias watched her face, the light flickering across her eyes, and saw there not weakness but the raw edge of endurance. He set the blade aside, cleared his throat. His voice came low, unused to confession. "My wife died here, in this cabin." He glanced toward the chest in the corner, the one that held the dress folded in white silence.
"She carried a child."
Neither drew breath by the time it was done. Nalin lifted her gaze to him at last. There was no pity there, only understanding. "I buried them beneath the cottonwood out back," he continued, voice rough. "Since then I've kept to myself. The land asks enough without company. And yet," his eyes returned to the fire, "some nights are too long for a man to bear alone." The room quieted again, but it was no longer emptiness. Something had shifted, as if a barrier had been lowered, if only by inches. They were not settler and exile, not savior and victim. They were two souls who had both been left behind, sharing the same fragile firelight. The logs crackled, sparks rising. Nalin's hands, folded in her lap, trembled once, then stilled. Elias's rocking chair groaned softly as he leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. watching the fire as though it held answers neither of them could voice. Outside, the snow creaked under the bite of frost. Inside, the warmth grew steady, not blazing but enough. That night, when they lay down in their separate corners, the silence between them felt changed. It was not distance. It was space held gently, room enough for wounds to breathe, and in that space warmth stirred. Quiet, cautious, but real. The snow hardened under gray skies, crusted with ice that glittered like shattered glass. The range lay silent, but Elias felt the shift in the air long before he saw them. Tracks appeared first. Fresh, sharp prints cutting across the drifts beyond the cottonwood where two graves slept beneath the frozen ground. Hoofbeats carried through the stillness, muffled but certain. The stranger had returned, and he had not come alone. Nalin was at the doorway before Elias spoke. Her braid was bound tight, her shawl drawn firm across her shoulders, eyes steady. She needed no telling. She knew what shadows rode toward them. Elias checked the rifle by the hearth, loaded and ready. His hands moved with the calm of a man long resigned to storms, whether of weather or of men. By the time the riders crested the ridge, the snow stirred by their horses' hooves. Elias's horse stood saddled near the corral. 5 men rode down, Cole among them, his grin a scar stretched across his face. "You've kept more than cattle, Hart," he called, his voice carrying in the brittle air. "Land this wide, woman, by your fire. Seems greedy to keep both when others are hungry." His eyes flicked to Nalin at the door, and his grin widened. Elias stepped forward, rifle in hand but not raised. "Turn back," he said, his voice low but steady. "There's nothing here for you." Cole laughed, glancing at his men. "Hear that? The widower thinks he can hold against us all." His horse pawed the snow, restless. "Step aside, Hart, you know how this ends." Nalin moved then, stepping down into the yard, the wind tugging at her shawl. She stood beside Elias, not behind him. Her chin lifted, braid falling over her shoulder like a black banner. Her silence was sharp as steel. Cole's smirk faltered. "You let her stand with you?" He jeered. "She's nothing. Cast out by her own. You'll lose your land, your life for a ghost?" Elias raised the rifle at last, the barrel steady, his eye cold as the sky. "I've lost more than land before," he said. "I will not lose again." The words hung heavy. For a long moment only the horses shifted, the leather creaking. Cole sneered, but his men glanced at one another uneasy. They saw in Elias not bluster, not a man grasping at pride, but a figure carved from grief and endurance, willing to stand unbroken. One rider turned his horse. Another spat into the snow and followed. Cole cursed, fury twisting his face, but the weight of Elias's aim held him frozen. At last he wrenched his reins and wheeled his horse away, his voice carried back on the wind. "This ain't done, Hart." But it was. The ridge swallowed them, hoofbeats fading into the gray distance until only silence remained. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, the breath he had held easing out in a long stream. Nalin stood unmoving, her shawl pressed tight against the wind, her eyes fixed on the empty horizon. Only when the stillness deepened did she turn toward him. No words passed, yet the space between them felt different, less fragile, more bound. That afternoon, Elias saddled both horses. Without discussion, Nalin mounted one, her braid tucked beneath her shawl. Together they rode the boundary of the land, the snow crunching beneath hooves, the fence lines half buried but holding. The range stretched wide and endless, no longer a tomb but a place that might be endured, perhaps even lived in. As they rode side by side, the cold air stung their cheeks, but neither minded. Elias pointed to the low creek bed where thaw would come first, where cattle might drink. Nalin marked the sheltered hollow where sage grew, where firewood could be cut. Their words were practical, but each sentence carried something deeper, a recognition of shared ground. When dusk drew its blue veil across the mesas, they returned to the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the cottonwood behind it stood black against the snow, its branches bare yet steadfast. Inside, Elias stirred the fire higher, setting another log into the flames. Nalin sat near, her shawl loosening in the heat, her face softened by the glow. The cabin no longer felt empty, no longer a shrine to silence. She spoke then, her voice quiet as falling ash. "Tonight I need warmth." Elias did not answer with words. He simply adjusted the log, coaxing the flames higher, and pulled the chair closer to the fire. He sat beside her, the silence between them no longer a gulf but a bond. The flames rose, crackling, shadows dancing across the timber walls. Outside, the wind carried the cold across the open range, but inside the cabin warmth endured. Shared, steady, enough.